man must do his bit.
Welcome to another edition of The Public Interest. My name is David Granger, and on this series of programs, we examine issues of interest to Guyanese at home and in the diaspora. And today we will look at the question of the birth of the nation, what I call emancipation, because in my view, historically, emancipation in 1838, 1st of August, is the day when the Guyanese nation was born. This is not an ethnic statement. This is what I would call a historical truth. It is certainly, in my view, the most important historical event in the evolution of the nation, more important than even independence. This not only characterized, the spirit of the Guyanese people. There was 200 years of resistance, rebellion, marronage, running away. And when it ended on the 1st of August, it was an event that, had so many consequences that, we will discuss those consequences on this program. Certainly, emancipation movement was not something swift. It was not something sudden. It was not something short. It was long and slow. And it was the result of the struggle of enslaved Africans in the plantations for, as I said, 200 years. This is because the people wanted to free themselves and to destroy the system of enslavement. And I think their efforts resulted in a movement throughout the Western Hemisphere in which, the slave mode of production was eventually destroyed. And we have to go back to the transatlantic trade in captive Africans and the whole system of slavery. These were crimes against humanity. I think nowadays we know that they were crimes against humanity. And up to now, the level of United Nations and the level of other important international organizations, we accept that the transatlantic trade was a criminal enterprise. And here we are nearly 600 years later. And we now realize, looking at the events in America, George Floyd, that it was shameful, it was an uncivilized legacy of what you call Western civilization. It is the most outrageous act of inhumanity in the West, which boasts of having a Christian civilization. And you can see the descendants of the trade, transatlantic trade, and the system of enslavement are still suffering the effects of those two systems. We can look at what propelled what I call the emancipation movement. How did it come about? What are the causes? The most important factor to remember is that the enslaved Africans wanted to free themselves. These were persons who were living quite comfortably in the African homeland, who were torn by one means or the other, torn from their homelands and transported under most cruel circumstances into a strange country with strange people. And the shock led, of course, to resistance. From the time of captivity, even on the ships, some of them mutinied, some of them jumped overboard, and they tried every possible means to free themselves. We know in Guyana, we observed the Berbice Revolt in 1763-64. We observed we don't really observe, many people are not aware of the Demerara Maroon War, which broke out on what is now Region 3. There was a Maroon War. Maroons were living upstream in the Boer Seri. And in 1795, there was a very brutal war to suppress it. We know of the Demerara Revolt in 1823, and we know that in August 1823, over 200 Africans were slaughtered. We know of the Essequibo Revolt with Damon in 1834, but there were smaller uprisings. There were very many smaller uprisings that are lost to our memory, because in Guyana we don't study these things very carefully. And it's a pity that some of our children don't understand what happened. So resistance and revolt, rebellion, these were important. I would call it first factor that the Africans tried to free themselves. Nobody granted them freedom. They freed themselves. The second factor, which some people may not want to accept, is that there was economic change. International community wasn't standing still, and the sugar that we produced in the plantations of the West Indies and Guyanas was expensive and it was inefficient. A few people got very rich out of West Indian plantations, what is called the plantocracy. But this is mainly because the markets were protected and they were guaranteed sales of the sugar in Britain under what was called the mercantile system, in which the mother country purchased everything produced in the colonies, and the colonies purchased things that were produced in the mother country. That was like a closed system, but it's expensive to maintain that closed system because as Britain became a major manufacturing country, they wanted to buy cheap sugar from more efficient producers. And West Indian sugar was too expensive, and that is the problem that we face up to now in Guyana. In some countries in the Caribbean, they shut down the sugar industry, and producing sugar from sugar cane is still a tricky business, but we won't go there now. So they were advocates of the capitalist system. Capitalism is different from mercantilism. Again, the capitalism that was coming into vogue was a result of the Industrial Revolution. And Britain was trying to become the sort of factory of the world. It certainly was advanced. And the businessmen, the mercantilists, the capitalists, who were driving this change, wanted to get cheap food, cheap sugar, and they wanted to get bigger markets. So as they started to go towards other producers, it was found that the West Indian planters could not compete with the new producers, cheaper producers of sugar. So that was one of the reasons that people just got fed up of supporting these rich planters with their mansions in Britain. And the merchants were paying too much and supporting too few people from maintaining these West Indian colonies. Some of them were small and not efficient producers. The third factor, which we must bear in mind in terms of the emancipation movement, was public opinion. Sometimes people tend to dismiss public opinion, but we have to bear in mind that in the early 19th century, particularly after the French Revolution, there was what is called the Enlightenment. And along with Enlightenment, there was an upsurge in evangelism. And many people felt that, it was inhumane, it was cruel, it was sinful even to engage in human slavery. And as well, in fact, some of the evangelical bodies never accepted slavery, and there's some of them, even America now, people like the Amish and other religious sects just do not accept slavery. They wouldn't fight wars, but that's another matter. The point is that many organizations, associations arose to advocate the abolition of slavery. And in Guyana, many of the congregational churches, Arundel, Wilberforce, Buxton Village, they're named after abolitionists. So you can see the impact these people made on religion and, of course, in Parliament. And they were partly responsible for having the eventual passage of the abolition bill. So they can't be dismissed. You can't dismiss the Buxtons and the Wilberforces and the Arundels because they did bring about a change. And as I said before, the fourth factor is the geographical spread, that new countries, new colonies, new plantations were being opened in the East, in Australia and East Asia, in the East Indies, bringing new lands under cultivation. And free labor was cheaper than slave labor, because once you have enslaved labor, there will be revolts. You have to bring down the British West Indies Regiment. You have to suppress revolts. You have to chase the Maroons inland, and it was too much trouble. And when you have free labor, even though the conditions were oppressive, it turned out to be cheaper than trying to maintain people in slavery. So actually, slavery became too expensive. So as a result, the love affair of the mother country with West Indian sugar producers started to wilt, and eventually, towards the middle of the 19th century, there was a movement to bring an end to this inhumane trade from the enslaved Africans themselves, from the mercantile community, and from sheer economics. It wasn't making sense to maintain slavery. And of course, new lands were being opened, and you couldn't enslave the whole empire. You could enslave part of the empire part of the time, but not the whole empire all the time. So this is the situation we arrived at in the early years of the 19th century. And I would say that to trace the history of emancipation, we can look just at the 19th century and see from the early years of the 19th century, from 1807 or thereabouts, there's this movement to abolish this trade. First thing to do is abolish the slave trade. So from 1807, it was illegal to bring any captive on a British ship, and the British Navy enforced it. So you see the power of the commercial class. The same people who were promoting the slave trade, well, not the same people, the same class of people, the merchants who were promoting the slave trade previously were now against it because it was too costly. And the British Navy was used to enforce the abolition of the slave trade. This is what happened in 1807. So slavery continued for some time after that, but trading was made illegal. So that was the first phase. Of course, this caused, it seemed to be the solution, but it also caused problems because it meant that the supply of new captives from Africa was cut off. It meant that the plantations started to work the present enslaved Africans more than before because there was no easy replenishment. And that caused problems. It meant that the punishments became more cruel. The laborers were driven harder. So the abolition phase started in 1807 with the actual passage of an act of parliament. A few years later, we moved into the second phase, which is the amelioration phase. That is to say, the British government, again coming under pressure from the merchants and the manufacturers, proposed an amelioration plan, that is an improvement, not abolition, they're improving the conditions under which the enslaved Africans worked. Looking at those conditions now, they seem so ridiculous. For example, they reduced the amount of hours that you can have a person laboring in the field to 10 hours. So you can imagine what it was before. 10 hours of work is a lot, literally down to dusk. It reduced the amount of lashes that you could punish a person with to 25. And again, before that, it was unlimited. And of course, the flogging of women. Before that, even pregnant women were flogged. and that was abolished. It actually permitted enslaved Africans to marry. Before that, they couldn't marry. And of course, if a man and a woman live together, they can be separated. If they have children, they can be separated from the children. The children could be sent to some other, sold to some other plantation. So that seemed to be a big move, and this is what was happening in the 1820s. That families could no longer be broken up by sale, and it allowed the enslaved Africans to actually own property. These are the sort of things that were happening. They could give evidence in criminal proceedings, but they were not free. This is what was introduced to improve the conditions of slavery, not to abolish slavery. So I would regard that as the second stage. The third stage is the apprenticeship stage. Now, as a result of the revolts and the rebellions that were taking place, particularly in Guyana and Jamaica. For example, in Guyana, remember that in 1823, we had this massive rebellion in Demerara, in which 200 Africans were slaughtered in August 1823. We commemorate that as the Demerara Martyrs. And 10 years later, almost exactly 10 years later, in 1833, as a result of the resistance and revolt of the Africans themselves, and of course the other factors I mentioned, the role of the evangelists and the anti-slavery movements, a bill was passed, and an act was approved in the British Parliament in 1833, stating that with effect from the 1st of August 1834, slavery will be abolished. But many people were misled into thinking that Africans became free on the 1st of August 1834. Well, that is fake. That's bogus. It wasn't true. What it meant was that from 1st of August 1834, they introduced an apprenticeship scheme by which the very enslaved Africans were required to remain on the same plantations under the same masters. But the only thing that was changed is that they were no longer called slaves. They were called apprenticeships. That is, the Europeans felt that the Africans had to be taught how to be free. But that wasn't true. What really they wanted is to give the planters an opportunity to adjust. And they wanted to free the enslaved Africans 6 years later in 1840. But of course, there are some people who didn't understand. They thought freedom was freedom. And one of those persons, of course, was named Damon. And when he heard that he had to go back and work on the same plantation, the same master, he raised the flag at La Belle Alliance on the Essequibo coast. And of course, he was captured and hung outside the public buildings in Georgetown. What the apprenticeship scheme was meant to achieve is that the planters, it wasn't in favor of the Africans, the planters were being given an opportunity to adjust. The working hours were reduced to 45 hours per week, and those who were graded or classified as domestic workers, those who worked in the houses of the masters and so on, they were allowed to be free in 1838. Well, of course, things didn't work out that way, and there was resistance, and it was decided that persons of any category, domestic or field laborers, prairie laborers as they were called, were to be freed in 1838. So the apprenticeship scheme was not really freedom. And that is why in Guyana we don't regard 1st of August 1834 as Emancipation Day. We regard 1st of August 1838 as Emancipation Day. Now, the last phase is actual emancipation. That is, all apprentices domestic or field, were freed from 1st of August 1838, 2 years before it was originally intended. This is because the planters continued to be abusive and the so-called apprentices continued to resist. So things were very difficult for the Africans between 1834-38. And, to make things worse, the planters, the owners, so-called, the proprietors, were given compensation. In the case of Ghana, they got 4,297,000 pounds. The planters were compensated, and of course the Africans got nothing. They got 4 more years of hard labor. 84,195 Africans. 84,000 got nothing, and the planters got 4 million pounds, 4,297,000 pounds. So this is the paradox of British capitalism, British humanity, that you reward the slave owners and you deprive the Africans of any form of compensation or reparation. That is why, up to the present day, there's a cry for reparations among the descendants of the victims of that transatlantic trade in the Caribbean. And that you can understand why we need reparations, because the British were inclined to compensate the proprietors, but not the victims. Bear that in mind. 4,297,000 pounds sterling. You can imagine what that would convert to nowadays if that money was paid in reparations. Now, my friends, we come to the consequences of this emancipation movement. So we've arrived at a stage at which we've looked at the causes, we've looked at the phases of emancipation. We can now look at the consequences. And this is why I feel emancipation is the birth of the nation, 1st of August 1838. It's not an ethnic holiday, it's not an African holiday, it's a national day of observance. Because, first of all, there was demographic change. That is, it triggered indentured immigration. First of all, Portuguese started to come because they felt that Africans would have walked off the plantation. This didn't happen. Well, these are not Portuguese from Portugal. These are Portuguese from Madeira, which of course is part of Portugal. Madeira is an island, a group of islands in the Atlantic, but we call them Portuguese. They were Madeiran Portuguese. But in any event, those were the first to come. Long before 1st of August 1838, then Indians, nowadays, I think according to the law, they call persons of Indian descent, started to come. Even before emancipation, they started to come in May 1838. Emancipation was in August 1838. And then there were other, well, the Portuguese are Europeans anyway. People came from West Africa because if the British Navy found, persons on ships who were captured, who were enslaved, they could free them. That's how places like Sierra Leone, were populated. People were repatriated. Of course, you didn't know which part of Africa some of them came from, but they were sent back and put in settlements in Sierra Leone. Some of them came to British Guiana as well. And of course, the Chinese eventually came. So what happened is that in the 80 years after emancipation, 340,000 immigrants came into the country. Europeans, West Africans, West Indians, East Indians, Chinese. So in addition to the Amerindians and Africans who were already here, and European planters who were already here, you had these 340,000 new immigrants coming over a period of 80 years, not all together. This is why Guyana looks the way it looks, because of emancipation. And these persons came in here to work, mostly in the plantations. But after these persons were enslaved, they came with contracts. They were called indentures. That's why they call indentured immigrants. They had contracts. and the proprietors of the plantations had to abide by those contracts. Um, so the Chinese, the Madeiran Portuguese, and East Indians, and some West Indians actually came on contract laborers, not enslaved. So it's quite different. So the demographic change was the most significant and the most obvious. The second change was the economic change. Now, once people became free, they wanted a change from the plantation diet. They wanted to have their own foods. The Chinese brought some of their own food. The Portuguese brought some of their own food. Indians brought their own food. Africans wanted to cultivate their own foods. So the whole nature of agriculture started to change. There's cutting sugar and eating imported food. Smoke herring and salt beef. They wanted a change of foods, and they wanted to get other things, clothing and other materials which they needed in their homes and villages. Largely through the Congregational Church, we had the start of a system of elementary education. And then we had the whole governmental apparatus. If you notice the date of the establishment of the British Guiana Police Force, and notice the date of emancipation, you see that as soon as you got emancipation, 1 year later, July 1839, the British Guiana Police Force was established. So you know why the police force was established less than a year after emancipation. The prison service had to be started. Then people had to get coins, had to get specie. In those days, the coins were made of real silver, not nickel or some cheap material, and real copper. Of course, people wanted to save money, and remember when the village movement started, the proprietors paid with coins, specie, real coins. Banks were open. So the whole economy started to develop. People started to go to the hinterland. See, that's why 1st of August is so important. It's the start of a new economic system, a new economic change. And of course, there was a geographical change. Before emancipation, there was just a string of plantations, literally from Skeldon right through to the Pomeroon. Just a string of plantations, one after the other. But the geographical transformation of the country occurred because once people were free, they tended to go off the plantations. Not just the Africans, but also the Chinese and Portuguese and Indians. Nobody wants to live in a plantation. So the exodus, the great village movement, was triggered by the act of emancipation. So, my friends, you can see that, in every way, demographic, economic, and geographical, the emancipation of Africans in 1838 triggered the birth of a completely new, the birth of the nation. It triggered the birth of something we don't recognize as Guyanese in terms of villages, in terms of people, in terms of occupation. And that is what emancipation did for us. The modern nation, what we see as Guyana today, was really born in every demographic, economic, and geographic and political sense on the 1st of August, 1838. So even though the emancipation movement was long and slow, it was always propelled by the desire of the Africans to be free. And it was their resistance and their rebellion, which made emancipation possible on the 1st of August. So we all benefit for all time, forever. Regardless of where you came from. You can look back to 1st of August, whether you're Chinese, Portuguese, Indian, African, or American. Everybody who is a Guyanese could look back to that 1st of August and say we all benefited from it. That was the foundation of our nation. And that is why everyone should celebrate 1st of August, regardless of your ethnicity. Thank you, and may God bless you.